Test. Oh, yeah, looks like good. Okay. I'm Phil Wyman, and this is the Wild Theology Podcast, where the world, the humans in it, and God are all wilder than we've been told.
That's your intro?
So, you'll get philosophy and theology and crazy stories that come from 30 years of pastoring,
boring,
20 years of festival work,
whatever,
and the mud and blood of wrestling with the living in the spaces angels fear to tread.
Trying to sound interesting, are we?
Oh.
Yeah, you think you got something to say?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the problem, dimwit.
I'm a lot smarter than you think.
Yeah, you tightened your shoes this morning.
Whatever. We're Phil Wyman, and this is Wild Theology, where you get to argue with your own ideas.
And lose.
That's the point. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Phil Wyman. Okay, so this is podcast Wild Theology number 42, and I'm with John Robinson. I'm sitting in his house in Talysarn, Wales, and John is from Tennessee. He's the general director and founder of a group called Lingua Christi, and we're going to talk about some of the things that Lingua Christi is doing and what makes John tick. I think you're going to find John really interesting. I think you're probably the most intelligent person I've ever met on these topics of the languages, minority languages of people. There's certainly around Europe, but you seem to be able to talk about it almost anywhere in the world at will. So this is John Robinson.
Hello, everyone.
And he's a fluent Welsh and Romanian speaker and an opera singer.
Once upon a time, yes.
Well, you sound like an opera singer when you talk.
Oh, well.
So, say a little bit about Lingua Christi.
I think people who are familiar with sort of the Christian mission enterprise would understand in an international setting that some sort of language acquisition is necessary, because it's about communicating something, and you can't really do that if you don't have some sort of communicative medium. So this is sort of par for the course, really. You assume that if you're going to go to a particular country, you will learn the language of that country so you can communicate with people.
Right.
Now, in certain parts of the world, due to colonization, usually European colonization, you have a current situation where you have a trade language that still has official status,
right,
left over from the colonial era, and everyone would think colonialism is not good, this is a bad thing, and that trade language is a necessary evil.
Right.
But in terms of missiology, you would also realize, yes, you need to know that trade language, but if you're really going to communicate the truths of the gospel to people in a way that makes sense to them, you have to do that in their heart language. In other words, the language that they think and access the most intimate and important parts of their human experience in. And that would be a sort of common practice in many of these places. So if you're in a Francophone country in West Africa, you'll probably learn French, and it's different. West African French is its own type of French. So you'll know French, but then you might learn another local language in order to be more effective in communicating the gospel. I think there's a disconnect when it comes especially to large Christian missionary organizations and I guess movements or I suppose initiatives in Europe, because this seems to be lost here.
Right.
And what I would say to that is that Europeans have actually been colonizing their neighbors for centuries before they ever thought about the Southern Hemisphere, as it were. We just don't tend to think of it in that way.
Yeah.
And, of course, you also have a situation where at one point you would have had an ethnic group, and at that point in history, their ethnicity and their language were one and the same. For example, Welsh. To be Welsh meant to speak Welsh. These were one of the same things. To be English was to speak English. Well, Anglo-Saxon, and then Middle English, influenced by Norman French, etc. But to be this thing was to speak this thing.
Right.
But with colonization of neighbor in this way, one language comes into dominance Not even because there are more speakers, but for political reasons, sometimes military reasons. There are all sorts of reasons why this happens. So then you have an element of the original population, in order to survive and move forward, who would still see themselves as this ethnicity.
Right.
But this is language shift. They're shifting to the new language almost out of necessity. They can't really seem to get ahead. But this is not the creation of two aspects of one particular ethno-linguistic group. It's the creation of a new ethno-linguistic people group. And this is what we would challenge with indigenous minority language groups in Europe. We would challenge the idea that the Welsh are one people who just happen to speak. Some of them speak Welsh, some of them speak English as a primary means of communication. We would say instead there are two Welsh peoples, both from Wales, both ethnically, culturally, historically Welsh, but one has a primary communicative medium through Welsh. Doesn't mean that they don't know English, but their most important, intimate, special communication, I guess, arena in their lives are dominated by Welsh. Then others where it's dominated by English, but there would still be the sense, I belong to this land, I have a historical tie here, this is my ethnicity, Welsh. And then you would have people in Wales who have moved in from outside, and it could be for some time, more than one generation, who would be English-speaking primarily, and they would also more see themselves as British in a generic way than Welsh. And so they tend not to have the same sense of nationhood or ethnic connection, but they feel more connected to a larger thing that you might call the United Kingdom or something like this. And I think that you will see some of this in most of these indigenous minority language groups. If you went to Brittany, you would find people who would say, I'm Breton, but I don't speak Breton. You'd find other Breton who would be Breton speakers. That would be their primary language, even though they would have knowledge of French. But then you have other people there who would say, I'm as French. I'm more French than I'm Breton. You know, Brittany is just part of France.
It's where I live, but it's not doing.
So we would say all these three people groups are all important, and also the expatriates who come from other countries and regions. They're all important. But what we would perhaps caution against is taking one method or linguistic medium to try to reach everyone, thinking that it will trickle down to all the other groups. We would say, let's have some specificity in the linguistic approach that we use in communicating what we would consider to be gospel truth.
So in the same sense that many Christian leaders, missiologists would say, you can't have one cookie-cutter way of creating a church model. You can't take your California church model that works so good on the beaches of Southern California and go set your Calvary Chapel or your Vineyard Church up just like that. It's not going to work in Ghana the same way, or it's not even going to work in Texas the same way as it did there. You're saying the same thing then about language as well. You're taking this idea of cookie cutter and, sorry, you just can't preach the gospel in a way that's convenient for you. It has to be what you're looking at. Sounds to me almost like looking for the language somebody would say, I love you in.
Yes, that would be a very good way of putting it, because sometimes, especially those of us who come from an English-speaking context where that's our first language, we're used to using it, and English has now become the lingua franca, of the world in many ways. It is an international language. It's a very popular language to learn as a second language, and it is the language of a lot of diplomacy, a lot of economics, a lot of all sorts of things, research, academics. It's not exclusive, but it does have a huge influence, and some would say negative influence linguistically sometimes. But I think for us, Christians coming from that context as native, as natural, we have a very utilitarian view toward language. It's a means to an end. It doesn't really matter what language.
We really only had one school of philosophy developed in America, and it was based off of practicality.
pragmatism.
You're right.
Yeah. And so it is. It's very pragmatic. You use one language. Everybody understands it. And the problem is, I think, and of course this has been a debate for a long time. I saw a really good TED talk about this, actually, that was quite interesting. I can't remember what her name was, but she was a linguist. Because the debate is, does language affect your thinking, or does it not actually affect your thinking? Is thinking sort of a universal thing, and language is just a means of communicating it?
Right.
Or does the language actually affect how you think and view the world? And she was saying, I'm sorry I can't remember her name, I'll try to look it up. She was saying that in her research and others, that it actually changes the way you look at something. So, for example, I know that Dios is God in Spanish, or Dieu in French, or Bog in Russian. You pick the language. I know what the word means.
Right.
But when I say God, it says something different to me. I have an idea of what that means at a less academic level and at a more heart level. And this is what we would say, that people, they may understand what the word means, but does it penetrate an area where their deepest thoughts are, their deepest desires, their emotional understanding? Does that happen? And we would say, maybe not. At the end of the day, I mean, someone can access the message and respond to it in any language that they understand. I think there is a correlation between deeper understanding and discipleship with using the primary language of the heart, even if they speak 1, 2, 3 more languages. But I want to be really clear. I'm not saying it's impossible.
Right.
If somebody understands a second or third language, yes, of course, they can hear the message and respond to it. But I think it's more their own if it's in their language.
Sure.
In their first language, their heart language. And they own it in a way that they don't the other way.
Yeah.
I think. And I think it would be interesting for you to talk maybe to some Welsh-speaking believers. I think a couple that came to the Christian gospel through English and were converted and went to church in English and all this, and made a conscious choice to change to a church that used Welsh.
Right.
And it was a hard transition to begin with. They weren't used to Bible language in Welsh. They weren't used to, because everything had been done in English.
Yeah.
But once they made that step, I think they would tell you it made a profound change in their personal understanding of discipleship.
Now I was wondering, in terms of heart change, a similar thought popped into my head about those who go on mission and learn the language of other people and the shift that happens in them. And what brought that thought to my mind is when you made the statement about God and the different languages. And I thought about it myself, how I think of the word God in English and how I think of Dieu in Welsh. And there's something about the word Dieu, and I'm certainly not fluent at this point. I tell people I'm in a terribly uncomfortable phase of, if somebody's not fluent in Welsh, they think that I am. And those who are fluent in Welsh say, "Oh, good on you, keep trying." So it's the clumsy phase, right? But we're gonna do a quick time out and come back to this thought. So we took a short break to check on how the door was being fixed, and just before that, I was asking the question about the change of heart that happens to the person who comes on mission, learns a new language, and the transition that occurs. And what made me think about that was your use of the word God. And so when I thought about how I think of the word God in English and the word Dieu in Welsh, despite the fact that I'm in this clumsy phase of not being I'm not fluent, but I'm conversant, I feel something different about Dieu. And what's interesting for me, as somebody who just loves this country so much and wants to move here, Dieu feels more personal and deeper than God does. I'm not sure why that is, but do you see, you certainly have the experience yourself, both in Romanian and Welsh, as well as seeing it in other people. What begins to occur?
I think that is, that's kind of unusual, but I don't think it's, it's not wrong or anything,
Right.
I think it's, your experience is your experience, and you define it for yourself. I think that for a lot of people coming to it from the other side, where they have a language that was historically put upon them rather than one they chose for themselves, it's a fact that they have this second language, but their first language would be Welsh. Not everybody, obviously, as you know.
Yeah.
It usually works the other way. But it also, there's something, a profound effect, and I can attest to this personally. So people ask me, for example, what language do I think in? And I usually say whatever language I'm speaking at the moment.
Wow.
But every language learner is translating to begin with. You're translating in your head. But, and that's not, you don't need to, or you or any learner doesn't need to, punish themselves for that. That's a normal thing. But sooner or later, you just start, as you're speaking it, you just sort of get in, like I get sort of in Welsh mode. My thing, it's hard for me to switch, whereas first language Welsh speakers can do it quite easily. That they're amazing, really.
Right. And thus, Wenglish occurs.
Yes. Or they can shift, if they have a friend who's not a Welsh speaker, they can shift quite easily.
Right.
It takes me a little bit. It's like, then I get into English, then I have to switch back to Welsh, so I'm a little slower at it and more clumsy with it than a first language native speaker would be. But I would say that there is great significance to things, and there are certain things that are I'm so used to expressing in Welsh rather than English. And one of the things, because within a given year, I do a lot of supply preaching at chapels around, always in Welsh. Always in Welsh. I may do one in English once a year or something like that. But I find when I'm in the English services, corporate prayer, like a pastoral prayer, is hard for me in English. It's hard for me to think about it because I'm so used to doing it in Welsh. Now, if I'm back in the States, it's like a week or two before I'm back into that groove, and able to do that. But I do think that there is something about learning the language, and one that is so meaningful to the people that speak it, for our people, even if they come for a couple of weeks and they've learned, diolch and oskolachana and some basic phrases.
Where's the bathroom?
What's that?
I fixed it now, so the key, I'll leave the key next to the fan for you.
Oh, iawn, okay, diolch yn fawr. Oh, sorry. Oh, diolch yn fawr. Diolch.
Okay, there was a little Welsh about fixing doors. You just got on the podcast.
Great. So, but I will say, the longer you're in it, because I don't have family here. If I were married with children, the natural language of my home, if I were married to another American, would probably be English. We'd use Welsh outside, and the kids would use it at school. But I don't have that. I just have the friends that I have. And, usually my interactions are with Welsh speakers for the most part, or with some of the Americans that come by.
So the little community here in Talysarn is...
This would be primarily Welsh speaking.
Right.
And so it's interesting. I've been here a while, but it's sort of an older kind of traditional type of village, and I don't know a lot of people yet, but I know lots of people, if that makes sense.
Right.
I may not just know all the people right around me, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah.
So, but I think those who come are deeply affected by the language in that when they use it, there's a real sense of appreciation. If somebody's coming here like on a 3 or 4 week project, no Welsh speaker is going to expect them to be fluent.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's a difficult language. It requires work and dedication and time. It just takes time.
Right.
But the fact that they can say anything, and the fact that they try to honor them in their language, That's very profound, and then that affects profoundly, especially our college students who come on these projects. Like, oh wow, that really meant something to them. I said something very simple, 1 or 2 words, but it was like, oh, that meant something to them.
You know, so this is an interesting thing. Whether it's related to language directly, or it's a cultural distinction between how Americans are perceived. It could be one of those two things. But when I'm speaking to an English speaker, first language English speaker in Britain, and they find out that I'm a pastor, very quickly a block can come up that, I don't know if you don't want to go there. Let's not talk about that. You see deer in the headlights happen, right? So often here in Wales, when I'm speaking to native Welsh speakers, and they find out I'm the Californian who speaks Welsh, then they find out that I'm a pastor. And openness to spirituality is much more common. And whether that's a Welsh American interest versus an English American, or is it my English isn't their English, but my Welsh, in a sense, is their Welsh, right?
Yeah.
And an openness happens there. I don't know, but it's an interesting thing that I seem to have discovered over the last 10 years, that is not uncommon for that to be a little more open door.
Yeah, I think that when you actually get in the language and use it, and you make it a point to use it all the time, and that's one of the things that I did early on. I spent about 1.25 years up here in the north to be immersed in the language.
Right.
Then I moved to the south. Different way of speaking, but I kind of kept my northern even down there. But I was working in a Baptist union office, and my first day I went in there, and I asked them, please never speak to me in English. I know I'm going to make mistakes. I might have to repeat things. I might have to ask you what something is, but don't speak to me in English, because if you do, I'm never really going to move forward. And they didn't. So that sort of created a context where I have Welsh friends now that I would have, I don't know if I've ever spoken English with them. It wouldn't even occur to me to speak English. And I think sometimes for learners, though, the Welsh tend to be very patient and polite and courteous. Sometimes they're a little too easy on learners.
Right. And defaulting to English too easily.
Because they're very nice. It's like, they're trying and they're struggling. Let's just go to English. And it's like, I keep telling learners, you have to be the one that says, no, I'm just going to keep speaking Welsh. And that's what I did with people. And then they finally would just speak Welsh with me. I wouldn't shift to English. But I think now that I just start everything in Welsh for the most part, when I'm out and about, and it sort of takes me down that road. But I think, by the way, I should have warned you that I'm a notorious rabbit chaser. So we just chased a little one.
I chase rabbits too. That's part of this.
I would say that language does affect how you see things, I think.
Right.
And I think that's not a bad thing. And I think that it can also be a tool for some self-examination, culturally and linguistically, to see how cultural my particular Christianity might be.
Right.
For example, years ago I saw some concentric circles from a colleague of mine who was in Ireland, and I don't know where he got it. I wish I could tell you who. I didn't make it up. Somebody else, smarter than I am, made it up. But it was concentric circles, and in the center, it was like, it was ecclesiological. It was talking about the church. And the center of it was, what is the church to be?
Right.
What is it in its essence? And of course, we would look to Scripture, to see those basic things of what it's to be. The second circle out from it was, what does it do?
Right.
What's it supposed to
Right.
do? The activities of the church.
Right.
And again, this was determined by the Scripture.
Right.
But the last one is, what is it supposed to look like? And the thing is, the New Testament doesn't really give us a lot of information.
Pretty silent.
So that part is culturally determined,
Yeah.
not scripturally determined. And an example that I often use when we have our students here is this one. Years ago, I wish I could remember the people group. It was an African culture and language group, and I usually try to remember, and I've just gone because we're too simple in our understanding and say, oh, he spoke an African language, and there are hundreds.
Right. Yeah. What does
which
that
one?
mean?
They're not all the same language. But
Yeah.
so pardon my lack of memory at this point. But they were saying in a particular culture that for the offering, it was an act of worship, and they'd be singing, and each person would dance down to the altar and leave the offering on the altar. Now, it could be money, it could be a chicken, it could be, it's what they were offering, what they had. And so the offering time could take a long, long time. So I would say, does the Bible tell you that's how you're supposed to do offering?
Right.
No. Does it tell you not to do it that way? No.
You'll find that at Church of God in Christ, Black Pentecostal churches in the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
Music plays, and everybody goes down, whether they're giving or not.
Well,
and then it's time for missions, and they do another round, and then there's the building fund, and we're going to do it again. They dance and clap and sing.
Well, that's interesting because, that's an interesting parallel. But I think what I would then challenge a lot of these young people come, and especially many of them come from the American Southeast, the Bible Belt, as it's often called. And I said, how would that work at First Baptist, pick any southern town? And they'd say, that probably wouldn't work.
Right.
And then I would say, well, how many are you in churches where the only way I know how to describe it is the communion cloth folding ceremony?
right.
Where the deacons are elders,
and
it is like, I see it like Baptist churches.
Really?
Wow. They take it very seriously. It's almost like folding a national flag in a military funeral. I'm not making light of that. I mean, there is a real sense of holiness and solemnity.
Yes.
And so they do this, and it's part of the experience that's telling the congregation, something important is happening here. We should, when we do this, we need to be thinking, we need to be meditating. And I would say, does the Bible tell us that's how you're supposed to do the Lord's Supper? Well, no. Does it tell us you can't do it that way? Well, no. That works there. Now, it may not work for every generation. That's the thing.
Right.
That may change. But for a period of time, anyway, culturally, that was an appropriate thing that gave meaning to what people were doing.
Yeah.
So I think you can take a lot of these principles that apply to language and apply to the culture as well.
Right.
I
want to chase a bunny trail, one that I've heard a number of times from people who are visiting from England and they come to Wales. And they'll say, some of them have said, I've experienced, or my mom was there and this happened. And that is, they walk up to a pub and they're hearing people chatter in English inside, and the moment they walk in the door, people look at them and they all switch to Welsh. And they look at it kind of angrily, like, that's what the Welsh do to us. Is that...
I have never experienced that.
I haven't either.
And even before I was really pretty good in the language, I've never experienced anything even close to that. And I think most people would say, that's like an urban legend. It has no basis in fact. In fact, my experience is, if anything, Welsh people don't want you to be excluded. If they do anything, they may say a word or two in English to you.
Right.
So you're not excluded, if anything. Right. But I would switch the question.
Right.
And I would say to somebody who's assuming some things, do you realize that when you walk into a room of 20 people and all of them are speaking Welsh, comfortably. They're not doing it because it's part of the Super Welsh club. It's a requirement. It's their language.
Right.
They're not making a political statement. They're just, this is my language. But you walk in there, and all of a sudden, they all have to switch languages to accommodate you.
Right.
I would say to someone like that, does that not give you pause? Does that not make you say, okay, maybe if I were in France, I'd learn 5 words of French.
It's given me pause in the past. There have been times when I walk into a circle of people and they're all speaking in Welsh, and I'm barely keeping up. This happened one time down in the Mice, Castle Square in Carnarvon, and there's a group of about a dozen people. They're all speaking away in Welsh, and I knew 2 or 3 of them, and I step in, and I didn't quite understand something, and one of the people who knew me automatically switched to English, and the whole group immediately switched to English for me. And I made a comment about that please, you don't have to do that. In fact, I prefer that you don't, because I'm trying to learn. And they made a comment. It was about this very thing. Some people think we're trying to hide what we're saying from them, and we switch to Welsh, when the fact is the dominant language always rules, and if everybody knows one language, and even one person doesn't, it flips in a heartbeat.
Right.
And people do it without thinking. And I can't help if, some of the urban myth is maybe based off Wenglish.
Yeah,
you heard somebody quoting a movie as you walked in, but they were really speaking in Welsh.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the thing is that a lot of people, they may have learned an actual technical created Welsh word for a new technological term, but they'll just say the thing. Right. English is an international language. Even really strong languages like French and Spanish borrow words from English. Italian borrows words from English. German. Pretty much every major language in the world borrows words from English because there's a huge vocabulary.
But so we create a verb, and all of a sudden Queen Mindy stop you.
Welsh is a living language.
Right.
It's a living language. It's very rich language, a very expressive language. But why wouldn't they borrow an English word like French would or Spanish?
Right. Or English does.
English. Well, English borrows shamelessly from every language. You don't translate the glasnost in perestroika.
Right.
You just know what they mean. It's openness and restructuring. But you don't say openness and restructuring. You talk about glasnost. For those of us who remember the
for your afternoon nap, you still take a siesta.
A siesta, that's right. That's right. So I think there are just lots of myths, and I don't know why they're perpetuated or why they're believed.
Right.
When, I know very few instances where people are deliberately trying to exclude. Maybe there is, and it could be because the person is being pretty obnoxious. Usually if that were to happen, I would think it was sort of a knee-jerk reaction to somebody being kind of obnoxious.
Right.
But I mean, I have to watch myself when I'm around other Americans because there are certain Welsh people that I just don't speak English to them. I have to think about it in order to include somebody.
Right.
It's not a deliberate thing. It's just I'm not used to speaking in English with this person.
Right.
And I have to remember, so-and-so doesn't speak Welsh. And I have to remember to include that sort of thing. But you mentioned something that may be a rabbit trail from the rabbit trail.
Right.
Another thing that we often teach that I think is good in terms of communication of the gospel message when a language is involved.
Right.
Because if you take person A and you take person B.
Right.
And let's say person A wants to go in missions to share a message with person B.
Right.
Now person A speaks this language, let's say English as a first language. Person B speaks Welsh as a first language. These are not two languages that are mutually intelligible. They are really different languages, even though they're both Indo-European. Now, if communication is going to happen, we have to have a common communicative medium. Right. Either person A has learnt Welsh and can do that, or, which is more common, person B who speaks Welsh as a first language, speaks English as well.
Right.
But what I find, even though most Welsh speakers, their English is perfect, I mean, it's quite fluent.
Right.
Now, they wouldn't say so, but if I spoke French
Yes.
the way they spoke English, I would definitely consider myself fluent.
Right.
And I don't. But you have that. But I would say, regardless of how good your second language is, in any kind of exchange or conversation or dialogue, the person who is speaking his or her first language is always in a position of ascendance. They're more comfortable. It comes more clearly, more easily for them. They work less hard.
Yes.
And I would say that if we in missions are trying to follow or emulate the example of Jesus as the servant, we should be the ones who voluntarily put ourselves in a secondary position so that they will be in an ascended position and I serve them. They can communicate their eyes more fluidly, more expressively because they're speaking in their first language. And even though I may struggle, I might make mistakes, this is how we serve the people that we've come to serve, not by forcing them, because we have almost a bullying approach to evangelism. Even in English, we're a bit bullies sometimes when it comes to sharing, you know, a message of grace and freedom.
That's such a, well, it's a beautiful way of thinking of it. It's our stepping down in servitude by allowing them to take the ascendant and primary spot with their language while we struggle.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a beautiful picture.
So, but it's a hard one to get across, I think, particularly to North American missionaries.
Right.
Because, again, we're quite utilitarian, and there's a genuine sense of urgency. We have a message to share. We want everybody to hear it, and all of these things.
Sure, and we tend to think of the gospel as primarily an intellectual assent to something.
Or a transaction.
Yeah.
I do something and I get something.
Right, so I have to get this across to you, and you say yes to it, and when you assent to that thing, then bang, you have it.
Right.
Where this seems far more holistic when you're talking about, and I love the terminology, lingua Christi. I love that.
Well, holistic is a good word, because I think this in general, the good news of Jesus should infiltrate every part of our lives.
Yeah.
And it's easy for me as an evangelical. I am an evangelical. I don't really hide that fact. It's easy for me to see this as a brain thing, a mind thing. That Christianity, the gospel affects my mind. It changes how I think. Yeah. And that's true. It should do that. The renewing of your mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to love God with my mind.
Exactly. But it also affects our hearts.
Yeah.
And our emotions. It should affect every aspect of our lives, our social interactions. Now, I'm not always a perfect example of that, but I do hold it as a standard, as something to which to aspire.
Yes.
So,
So, I want to close out with asking you how people can get involved with you and your work with Lingua Christi.
Well, I think probably the best start is to find us on the website, and it's just Lingua Christi. That's LinguaChristi.org.
Okay.
And go there, and you'll find out a lot more about us.
Okay, and you're doing like short-term missions things, church planting as well.
That's the goal, but also church strengthening, because we partner with a lot of our Christian brothers and sisters here in the Welsh-speaking community.
Okay.
Yeah, we would love to see these churches grow and flourish, and we can help that in any way. Let's do that. But we also realize there are places around that need some sort of new type of expression of church in Welsh.
Right. So at this point, what language groups are you?
The main ones right now are Welsh, but we're branching. We've had historic work in Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, and also Breton.
Yes.
But our circumstances had changed a few years ago.
Right.
So we're sort of rebuilding, trying to readdress those. But we have developed a new partnership in the Basque Country, in Basque.
Right.
And we've made some good connections in Galicia. It's still early days of looking at Galician trying to encourage some discussion among the believers there.
Right.
Because, I mean, we would be interested, like any mission agency, is forming a team, church planting team, going to an area, learning the language or languages, planting a church and that. But it would be much better if we can plant a seed of this and encourage and help the national believers there to do it, to start planting churches in these languages. So we're willing to do both, but it's much better if we can just be an encouragement and help to national believers to do that. Yeah. While at the same time wanting to be about the work ourselves. Right.
And so now you've had some teams going Ireland, Wales, Cornwall.
And we've had them in Cornwall.
Right.
And of course, we would all admit that Cornish is a very small language, but we would say every language and form of expression is important to the people who speak it.
That's right. Yeah.
And so if it's important to them, it should be important to us. Manx Gaelic is another one. I know that there's some people that would say, "Oh, well, nobody actually speaks Manx," but there are growing numbers of Manx speakers. It is a revived language, as is Cornish, but so is Israeli Hebrew.
Some of those Manx speakers, they're learning it because it's being taught to them as their first language in the home.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And but because I think most of us would look at Israeli Hebrew today, modern Hebrew, as a living, very successful example of a language that had died as a spoken language. Biblical Hebrew hadn't been spoken except within the liturgy and in academia, hadn't been actually spoken as a community language for a couple thousand years.
Yeah.
But, with the creation of the State of Israel, what are we going to speak? Because it was Jewish people from all over coming there. So it's like, let's form a modern, simplified version of Hebrew. Let's teach everybody real quick how to use it. Modern Hebrew is born and very successful. So.
Okay. So this has been John Robinson, and the website again, one more time.
Linguae Christi, one word, LinguaeChristi.org.
And you want to check it out. This guy rocks. He's really smart. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you to my patrons who help make these missional travels and these podcasts possible. Without you, I couldn't do it. God bless you. If you'd like to support this project, you can do so here on Patreon for as little as $1 a release. And at the most, that's $4 a month.
Why on earth would anybody want to support us?
Well, I think we're pretty cool, and maybe some people believe in what we're doing.
Oh, come on, you believe that?
Yeah.
Don't you ever think you're just a little too weird for the average person?
Yeah, sometimes.